Okay, thank you again, everyone, for coming. We really appreciate everyone being a part of this event in this NYIC redistricting convening. We've got over 80 people so far here attending, and there's a lot more that are still arriving. But we will get started, and we really appreciate you being here for us to kick off this really exciting redistricting educational event, and also it's a kickoff to our advocacy campaign at the NYIC. We have a number of really great speakers who are going to give their perspective on redistricting from regions across the state. Like I say, we have about 85 people here so far representing all of the regions across the state. And we have some people here representing national organizations as well, and really people who work in all the various areas around civic engagement and redistricting. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Murad Awada, who is the co-executive director of the New York Immigration Coalition, to give a welcome and opening statement.
Thank you so much, Asher. And thank you all for joining us today as we kick off our convening on redistricting. My name is Murad Awada. I am the interim co-executive director of NYIC and NYIC Action. I want to thank our amazing staff who have organized today's convening. Huge shout out to Asher Ross, our entire member engagement team, as well as our membership capacity building team, who put a lot of thought in organizing today. People choose their political representatives, not the other way around. That's the foundation of a fair democracy. But for decades, partisan gerrymandering has corrupted New York's electoral system, giving political parties license to suppress the voting power of minority groups and manipulate legislative districts in their favor. In 2010, we saw those in power gerrymandered their way into continuing to hold on to power. Fair redistricting is critical to ensuring fair political representation and power for all of our communities. And it's up to us to make sure our voices are heard. Today, the NYC begins our work on redistricting with this powerful convening. We will bring the powerful grassroots coalition that we built and the successful tactics that we used in the New York Count census work to the next stage of the fight, New York's redistricting process. The redistricting fight is Census 2.0. It's one of the major reasons why we fought so hard to get a complete census count. Today, in our convening, we will explore what's at stake for all of us in this year's redistricting process and have a collaborative discussion on how we can educate and mobilize our communities to make a difference. Thank you all for joining us today and look forward to the lively discussions. Back over to you, Asher.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Murad. And I actually would like to introduce myself. My name is Asher Ross, and I'm serving as Senior Strategist at New York Immigration Coalition Action. And I will be helping to lead some of this work along with a lot of my colleagues at NYIC. So thanks a lot, Murad, for that opening. And I just wanted to share today's agenda before we proceed. And we are actually going to be dealing with an overview of redistricting in the state and nationally, but we're also going to hear the perspectives of our local partners at NYIC and of people from across New York, and hear from them about the impacts of unfair redistricting in their communities. And that, I just wanted to say, is really a focus of today. Isn't so much to talk about the technical and legal aspects of redistricting, although we will cover that and we will give an overview of those things. But the purpose of this event and this campaign is really to elevate the voices of people locally and to educate and mobilize people locally by talking about and focusing on the impacts that unfair redistricting has on our communities. So with that, I want to pass it over to Lucia Gomez to talk about what's at stake in our redistricting in New York. Lucia is the political director of the New York City Central Labor Council, as well as an expert on redistricting and someone who has played a major role in her own right in the past. So Lucia, thank you so much for being with us. And I am going to hand you the mic to talk about what's at stake in redistricting.
Thank you, Asher. I'm still shocked that people call me an expert. And I think that has a lot more to do with, that just feels like I'm really old now, and I'm not. But about 23 years ago, I had my chance to get engaged and involved in redistricting through the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Funds, now Latino Justice Pro-Def, and always really proud to shout them out because, you know, for decades they've played an amazing role within the redistricting process, not just in New York City or New York State, but definitely I had an amazing chance throughout the Northeast, Florida, and even visited, you know, St. Thomas Virgin Islands at one point to try to see what kind of process they did in terms of their redrawing of the lines because of a large Puerto Rican and growing Dominican base in St. Thomas and St. Croix. And so, you know, I got a chance at that time with the existing president of Latino Justice, Juan Figueroa. I mean, gosh, that was such a bad memory. Juan Cartagena, who's the President General Counsel now of Latino Justice Pro-Def, he was our general consultant at that time on redistricting, and Angelo Falcon, who passed away about 3 years ago, and he was the president of the National Institute for Puerto Rican Policy. At that time was the policy division of Latino Justice Pro-Def, and we took on the task of replicating something that they had done in 1990, which is establishing Latino voting rights committees in about 8 states: Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, New York City, Florida. Amazing experience of doing these kinds of seminars. And I remember hanging out with a laptop and a projector, all because we thought, and we still think, and I still think, and if anything, that has grown even more so, that this is the most fundamental process to building power, democratic power, political power, economic power in our communities at the start of a new decade. It's sort of like I live my life based on an electoral calendar, not just because, you know, I'm the political director of the CLC, but because I know the huge shifts of power that happen when census takes place and the numbers come out and who's paying attention to it, and then how we redraw districts. And I'm not saying it because I'm crazy and I follow a political calendar alone. I would say there is an element of that, but it's also because I've seen it. I've kind of seen it play out, both people who intend to run for political office, and I meet them right in their preemie stages, and they start shaping the district the way they want to see it because they grew up in such and such house versus another house, and they start making their moves with the different political parties. I can think of a couple of people that were like that in my office every other day, trying to get me and convince me to tell me where the population growth was happening so that we can advocate for districts, perhaps straddling 2 other assembly seats or state senate seats, or, you know, county boundaries, and where to decide to move certain, you know, districts and certain around certain waterfronts, or protect. They knew things that I didn't know, right? That they were already negotiating certain projects, and they wanted to make sure those projects were in the district that they supposedly had already gotten sign off that they would be, you know, running in, and that happened. I saw it. I saw it actually. You know, actually take place, where they said that they would be the candidate, and they ended up becoming the candidate and winning, and a couple of things happened after that. But the amount of power that could essentially be generated just by engaging in the most, you know, rooted political process like redistricting, I've seen it. It's incredible. One, you get to know these neighborhoods like you've never had before, from the lens perhaps of, you know, going from what you see on the ground of where the store is and where the, you know, the other corner bodega is, and, you know, where the school is, and when you had an event on the ground as a community-based organization, to understanding it numerically, understanding it with its geographic boundaries and its constraints. if anyone has ever knocked on doors and has cut turf, something that I do normally with, the voter activation network with the van, that there's a huge reason why those two election districts are divided, or why a district stops in one place and begins in another place. Some of them are natural boundaries. Some of them are forced boundaries. Some of them are boundaries that have been maintained that way and people love them that way, right? East of Broadway, west of Broadway, right? East of Concourse, west of Concourse, down the A line, down the C line, this is why we can do there, because the E line crosses through that. So I think there's a huge amount of like energy that's generated from the neighborhood when you can come from a community level and speak about your district because you know the ins and outs of it. I think as a nonprofit at that time, Latino Justice, and in the last couple of decades, they still, amazing organization playing in this realm. But the level of community input that is had, remember when we started in 2000, all I heard was the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side fighting over, 96th Street, how far into East Side we can go, and the West Side was fighting the East Side. Always heard that. Or Ridgewood doesn't want to be with Brooklyn because Ridgewood is Ridgewood, and if their zip code changes, somehow their car insurance goes up. It was all these neighborhood elements that had organizations like Latino Justice, like the Asian American Legal Defense Fund and Center for Law and Social Justice, communities of color, advocacy groups, and legal justice groups weren't engaged. It was so rare to get a voice from a Latino neighborhood in a district to talk about the power, a collective power of a community. And, I really thank the NYIC, really were as engaged in 2010, redistricting in the same way that I feel like, it wants to be. I think that, now more than ever, because of the changing dynamics with, the courts and the fact that New York State, and you're going to hear more about it, New York City in particular, used to have 3 boroughs where Section 5 required. So a lot of things had to get pre-cleared by the Department of Justice. That's no longer the case. Under Section 5, I'm sure we'll get more clarity and an understanding. But I know that the impact is not just about who testifies and what they say at the hearings, even though that's amazing to get legislators to hear about their district from the perspective of, a community member and community groups that are talking about where they can and continue to have power or not, where the shifts are and where people want the shifts to be. But just on a basic level, for communities to understand the power of their vote, how about starting them off on where it all begins, which is census, what the numbers reflect. People are shocked by some of the numbers and the total numbers that they have, on a district level. So for me, this is the next 10 years that you'll be building out from now. It is not about, the process today and a year from now, or the 2023 city elections or the 2022 legislative elections, but it is future elections. And we've seen how the Senate in particular is going to have major shifts. It should, we were advocating for this, the last 2 cycles, but now more than ever, we should see changes there. And I would just end by saying that the impact that the next city council elections are going to have on the way in which districts in general are going to be drawn, not just at the city level, but at the assembly and Senate level, are going to have a huge impact. The 2018 race, of both AOC and everyone that came after that, is going to have a role in the redistricting process. And so, for me, the fact that there's going to be so many other community-based organizations beyond the advocacy legal institutions, beyond, those organizations that are more politically driven, it would be an amazing, chance for so many organizations to have a say in how to build power with community-based institutions and the power that they drive in moving, members of their communities to have a say in what their next 10 years will look like. So, I just want to emphasize how critically important this first stage is of just getting folks to understand, the amazing amount of power you can help bring to these neighborhoods well beyond just the process, right? It's about building the power for the next 10 years. So thank you so much for having me. And, I welcome the future conversations on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucia, and thank you so much for coming. And we look forward to working with you, and partnering more on this redistricting cycle. And I think the way you ended there is actually a really great transition to the next part of our agenda, which is to hear from some local organizations about their perspective on things, from their experience on the impacts of unfair redistricting and groups on the ground. So, we're going to hear more later. I just want to note that we are going to hear more later about NYIC's work that we're planning, but actually we need to hear from local organizations and many of NYIC partners and really try to elevate their voice and take on their input, and so that we can shape this campaign together that we're going to work on together over the next year. And so with that, I would like to move to hearing from some NYIC partner organizations and some other local organizations around the state. And I would like to introduce Liz Ouyang from APA Voice. We're really pleased to have Liz. She is the coordinator of APA Voice's Redistricting Task Force. And she also has several partner members of APA Voice that are also going to speak and give a perspective of several parts of this New York City and how it's been impacted in redistricting. So thank you, Liz.
Okay, great. Thank you for having us. We're proud to be part of NYIC's redistricting initiative and other initiatives across the city. We stand united in having marginalized groups' voices be heard. APA Voice Redistricting Task Force is now composed of 15 leading APA civic engagement groups across the city. The most recent just joined this morning. South Queens Women's March, Aminta Kilawan Nareen is on this call. Welcome, as well as Mei Li from Chinese Progressive Association, Jerry Vadamala with ALDEF, June G and Lillian G from OCA New York, as well as the organizations who will be presenting today. The APA population has grown exponentially over the past 10 years. The 2019 American Community Survey predicts Asian Americans will constitute 14.9% of the city, up from 11.8% in 2010, putting us over 1,186,000 APA residents in the city. 75% of this growth is in Brooklyn and Queens alone. As many of you know, this past year, Asian Americans have suffered from the misplaced backlash of COVID-19. We have experienced a 2,700% increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans. More than ever, APA communities of interest must be kept whole, or in large part in the same district, to be strong and united to elect candidates who will protect our communities. Now I'd like to introduce you proudly to some of our member organizations who will talk to you about the impact of cracked districts dividing APA communities of interest, as well as opportunities that may lie ahead. First, we will begin with Min-Yok. She is the Executive Vice President and Chief of Staff of the Academy of Medical and Public Health Services. She will be followed by John Alpert, Executive Director, taking our seat. After that will be Ramdat Singh, Civic Engagement Director of the Caribbean Equality Project. And lastly, Kevin Cho, Assistant Director from Korean Community Services. Manyok.
Thank you so much, Liz. Hello, everyone. My name is Manyok Yu, again, Executive Vice President at the Academy of Medical and Public Health Services, or AMPS. AMPS is a not-for-profit healthcare organization in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, and we work to bridge a health equity gap among communities of color by providing free clinical screenings, bilingual mental therapy, and individualized health education and social services to Latino and Chinese-speaking and Chinese immigrant populations, regardless of their immigrant status or ability to pay. Sunset Park is currently divided into 3 separate Senate districts, with the Asian community divided into 2 districts, District 20, which primarily consists of Brownsville and Crown Heights, and District 17, which primarily consists of Borough Park. There are a few connecting factors between these neighborhoods, and Sunset Park in terms of languages spoken, resources accessed, and transportation. Divided, Sunset Park will receive fewer resources. We have seen that translated into overcrowded schools, lack of affordable housing, increased homelessness rates, and rising food insecurity and unemployment. So we recommend unifying our communities of interest in Sunset Park, Bensonhurst, and Homecrest in South Brooklyn into one state Senate district. These South Brooklyn communities are connected by a need for linguistically and culturally appropriate services. During COVID-19, for example, our organization, which again is located in Sunset Park, received hundreds of calls from community members from across all these 3 different neighborhoods seeking assistance with public benefits, vaccine appointments, and testing, because we were able to offer help in their language. NYU Langone and the federally qualified healthcare centers in Sunset Park, one of the largest hospitals in South Brooklyn, similarly offers in-language services that attract Chinese speakers across these communities as well. The recent anti-Asian hate crimes perpetrated against our communities point to an urgent need to have a voice that represents and protects us. And a more equitable redistricting process will mean that we can streamline resources at a time when our communities are the most vulnerable. So I'll pass on. Thank you, everybody. And I'll pass this on to John.
Hi, everyone. Taking Our Seat is a Queens-based redistricting advocacy organization focused on data collection and map drawing. We found that that was the biggest gap within our community the last time around. And I just want to highlight 2 particular neighborhood clusters for you as an example of what happens when redistricting does not work for the people who live in the community. One of our focus areas is Jamaica Hills and Briarwood. And what we found was that that neighborhood was split among 3 different assembly districts. During the last redistricting, actually prior to the last redistricting, there was an enormous rezoning that happened in that area. And the South Asian community that was moving into the neighborhood was largely ignored. And what we found was that, and it's been a 12-year battle, was that about 3,000 affordable housing units are being built without the input largely of the South Asian community. And what I think people were very surprised to find is that even though the South Asian community in the neighborhood is eligible for those housing units because of their zip code, because the zoning district, because the assembly district, the city council district, and the zip codes don't correlate, it was very difficult to coordinate services among those who needed the most. An equally glaring problem we found just actually maybe just a mile down Union Turnpike, if you know Queens. The local Indian American community there has spent the last 15 years trying to build a community center. Problem there was the population center of the local Indian community is in one Senate district, and the location of the plot of land that they purchased is in another Senate district. And when that community went to seek permission to build from, it's the New York State Department of Health, the Department of Health demanded support letters from the local elected officials, and each elected official, did this, which is like, go ask the other person. So 15 years later, lots of litigation later, the issue is still in the courts. You can just imagine, without lack of political leadership and without voice in any of those districts, the community has had to spend, I would say, close to $100,000 in litigation to get a community center built. So you can imagine what that would mean to have us unified in one particular district. So with those 2 cautionary tales, I'm just going to kick it off to Ramdat.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. My name is Ramdat Singh. I'm the Director of Civic Engagement for the Caribbean Equality Project. And the Caribbean Equality Project is a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City that advocates for LGBTQ Caribbean voices. And one of those is building political power amongst Caribbeans and Caribbeans in general. And another cluster that we are looking at is Richmond Hill, South Ozone Park, and Richmond Hill, South Ozone Park, and Ozone. It's currently split into different, I believe, 4 different assembly districts. And that's problematic because, as you know, Richmond Hill, South Ozone Park is comprised mostly of Indo-Caribbeans and Punjabi communities. And the fact that because the assembly districts are split, I mean, the district is split into 4 different districts, it makes it impossible to organize this area in South Queens. And for instance, when South Queens was going through a mortgage crisis back in 2010, 2014, when tenants or homeowners would come to the assembly members, they would all point to another person, to another assembly member. And a lot of homes in Richmond Hill were foreclosed. And it didn't become a national issue until more national, it was put on the national stage. And what we're asking is for Richmond Hill, South Ozone Park to be unified under 1 or 2 assembly districts to ensure that, you know, Indo-Caribbeans and Punjabi voices are heard in our state and local affairs. And I'll pass it on to Liz.
Okay, I'm going to pass it on to Kevin, and then Kevin, when you're done, pass it back to me. Okay, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin. I'm with KCS. We are a social services based in Bayside, Queens. We serve citywide. Thank you, NYIC, for creating this space to have this. And I just want to, quickly highlight that there's been a tremendous growth in the Asian American population since the last 2010 census. Looking at different reports by the Census Bureau and also the Asian American Federation's report and the 2017 report, which they also used the American Community Survey, we clearly saw that there's been a huge increase. And this leaves us a good chance to reassess our communities and our needs. And, it's crucial that we draw these lines that are accurate, up to date, and that are community focused. And, making sure that our communities and our interests are kept whole and together. I just want to quickly highlight just 2 Senate districts on my part. Senate District 11, which is John Liu's district, and Senate District 16, which is Senator Tobias Stavisky's district. In both districts, there's been a huge increase. I would say in SD 11, there's been a total of 7.7 increase in total Asian population. And 6.3% of that are the Asians population who are citizens of voting age. And in SD 16, they've seen a 3.7 increase in total Asian population and 4.4% increase in the Asian communities voting age population. So the reason why I'm highlighting all of this is that we really need to make sure that we reassess our communities in these 2 districts and making sure that the needs of our communities are sort of reevaluated and kept whole. And, even within the Asian population, there's a huge Asian immigrant population still. So, for example, when we do these redistricting lines, we need to make sure that our community members are able to choose a candidate of their choice that can really reflect their needs, but also how these resources are allocated throughout these districts. So, a lot of these, we're still in the preliminary stages of doing research and gathering the data. And obviously we are all waiting for the 2020 census data report. So we're going to see how that comes out to be. But there's, I think there's a huge reassessment part that we need to do and making sure that our communities are really kept together. But thanks for the opportunity to talk. And Liz, back to you.
Okay. And we have other, obviously, areas around the city that are community of interest, but it was hard to get some of our group members on the call during the day. But for instance, Elmhurst and Jackson Heights is also a community of interest that we feel strongly about. And there is a South Asian community in Kensington, Brooklyn. Our Drum friends are on and hope that Drum will soon join APA Voice Redistricting Task Force. you know, we have issues all along congressional as well as city council as well. But okay, so thank you, Asher, and shout out to all my familia at NYIC and all my friends from 2020 census work. Really nice to see everyone again.
Great, thank you so much, Liz, and thank you, Manyak and John and Ramdat and our other speakers and Kevin and our partners at APA Voice, and for sharing your perspective on the impacts in New York City. And now I would actually like to move to a group from Western New York, Access of Western New York, and to hear from their executive director, Talib Abdullah. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. I'm Talib Abdullah. I'm the executive director at Access of Western New York. Happy to be here. Just wanted to be able to give you a point of view from Western New York. You know, sometime in 2020, I used to be asked quite a bit when we were assisting with the census, how important is the census? Well, what we're doing now with the redistricting, the census can have a significant impact on doing the redistricting. You know, ensuring that we know how many people are in specific areas, knowing the number of people that are in certain areas helps us to determine what those needs are. And one thing I can say that for Western New York, about 10 years ago, Access to Western New York, currently we're in District 63, but 10 years ago we were in District 58. And I can't say that transition for us did help us in that regard when we went from 58 to 63. And when we went in 63, there were a few neighborhoods that weren't included, and those, you know, there's a few suburban neighborhoods, Hamburg, West Seneca, they're not included. But when they are, it makes it more challenging when you go into your senator and you having requests and they're telling you that the majority of his or her constituents aren't interested in the things that we're interested in. And so for us, we have right now Senator Kennedy. And when we're able to go to Kennedy, Senator Kennedy listens to us, and we don't have some of the obstacles that some people may have, and specifically not with him. However, it's so important that we take an active approach and be active about it, because if we don't, then those lines would be drawn up and we won't be in the conversation or being considered. And so so it's important that we be involved as much as possible in this process. And for whatever we don't know, we want to try to get as much knowledge as possible, lean on our coalition members, New York Immigration Coalitions, and other partners for that assistance. Well, that's all I have for Western New York.
Thank you so much, Talib. Really appreciate you sharing that perspective. And yes, we have representation from across the state. So we want to move from Western New York to hearing about perspective from Long Island. And we have with us today, Ludmila Molina, who works in the legal department of Sepa Mujer in Suffolk County in Long Island. And I will leave you the stage. Thank you for coming, Ludmila.
Hi, thank you, everyone. So my name is Ludmila, and as you mentioned, I'm a GLAD graduate. I work for the legal department of Sepa Mujer, and I'm here on behalf of our director, Martha Maffey. So our organization stands for the well-being of immigrants in Long Island. One of our main goals is to unite our voices and be heard by social and political systems in our communities. Through a lot of our work, we strive to improve civic engagement by way of leadership skills and legal representation. So even though we have a lot of examples from which how our communities are affected here in Long Island for lack of representation, Today, I would like to focus on two of our most recent ones, which we've previously spoken about, which is the census. So among many challenges that came with 2020, one of the biggest challenges that we had was getting people to complete the census. Even though we ran into a little bit of a standstill at the beginning of the year, during the summer through the fall, our community organizing team and volunteers hit the grounds visiting dozens of locations here on Long Island, including farms, delis, laundries, you name it. Unfortunately, in addition to the shutdown due to COVID-19, there was this one barrier that we often found ourselves fighting. And that was this specific fear that was instilled in our immigrant community, the fear that if they completed the census, it would jeopardize their livelihood of themselves or family members that are not US citizens. People often fear that if they made themselves count, they would later find themselves in deportation. We tried our hardest in educating the community. We gave many talks, distributed materials, and helped people complete the questionnaire. Sadly, and is with the justified mistrust in the government, the damage was too profound. So today, we begin to see the effects of this. Not only is there an inaccurate reflection of the immigrant population, but we are at the verge of losing more representation due to these inaccuracies. This means not only less representation, but less funding for already limited resources and less priority for pressing needs. In fact, as I say pressing needs, I can't help but to think how many people we weren't able to help with basic needs like food or keeping a roof over their heads. After knocking so many doors, we were able to get some cash assistance funds, but ran out immediately upon receiving it. If that's not a reflection of needs, then honestly, I don't know what is. The disparities among our low-income communities were made front and center with this pandemic. Places that were hit the hardest were places like Brentwood, Central Islip, Bayshore, Hempstead, Huntington Station, Riverhead, all places that were predominantly made up of immigrants. Many of these immigrants are essential workers with no health insurance. As a result, many of those that became ill died sick in their own homes because going to hospital was not an option for them. Additionally, women were losing their jobs at a higher rate because they could not find childcare. Kids in these school districts that had to attend school online did not have the necessary tools to excel. For many children in these neighborhoods, having a laptop is a luxury that parents could simply not afford. These disparities are a reflection of redistricting and the reflection of injustice and discrimination. So our communities have continuously been ignored when it comes to drawing district lines. This cannot continue to happen. These lines need to begin to reflect social, cultural, racial, and other aspects of our community. Immigrants, communities need to be allowed to vote together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ludmila. Really appreciate that. And we have heard now from three different groups across the state. New York Immigration Coalition, I just want to mention, is a coalition of over 200 organizations. We have 100 organizations that are represented just on this call, and we're going to continue to build a coalition to advocate for fair redistricting. And it really starts with listening to the voices of our partners and hearing that local perspective on the impacts. And we've heard about, poor representation, a lack of accountability, failure to deliver the funding and the services that our communities need. And these are really some of the real impacts that happen locally. And I think it's critical that we really center those voices and those concerns in this work. So also, while talking about the local impacts, we want to make sure that our communities are really educated about the redistricting process and the historical context of it, how it's played out in New York State in the past. And so we are now going to switch gears to hearing an overview of the redistricting process and how this process works. And we're going to take about 10 minutes to hear about this from Fulvia Vargas de Leon, who is an associate counsel at Latino Justice. And so thank you, Fulvia, for coming. Fulvia is going to focus on redistricting up until the recent reforms. Later on, we're going to hear from Melody Lopez about the recent changes to the process and the efforts to reform. But in this section, please give Fulvia your attention, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Asher. I just want to, can I get a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fulvia Vargas de Leon. I'm an associate counsel with Latino Justice. And as Asher mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about the redistricting process in New York as it stood before the 2014 amendments. So when we talk about redistricting, we're really speaking about redistricting and how it plays out based on the federal laws that guide the redistricting process and the state laws that guide the redistricting process. So under the federal laws, we look at the Equal Protection Clause and we look at the Federal Voting Rights Act to guide the way redistricting is conducted in New York. Before we begin, some of us may be new to redistricting on this call, and I do want to clarify some of the terms you will hear throughout the redistricting cycle. You'll hear the term reapportionment, you'll hear the term redistricting. They are different, not interchangeable either. Reapportionment refers to the process of determining the amount of seats each state will have in Congress. So the way the 435 seats are going to be allocated based on the change in population after the census count is released. Redistricting, however, refers to the redrawing of congressional and legislative electoral district boundaries every 10 years, so every following each census count. All right, so one person, one vote. This is the guiding principle, I think, for redistricting. You'll hear this term come up often. It's based on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. When we speak about one person, one vote, we are highlighting the principle that in a representative democracy, every vote must be of equal weight. In redistricting, this means that when districts are drawn, is done in a manner which ensures that every individual has equal opportunity to participate in the electoral process. The Supreme Court has clarified what that means when we draw state legislative maps, and that means that they should be comprised of roughly equal populations. Now that's roughly equal, not exactly equal, so that means that there is some deviation among districts, both on the legislative level and the city level as well. And Evanwell v. Abbott, I just want to highlight a case. We currently use total population. The census count is based on total population, which means that's what we use when determining these districts. There was a challenge in 2016 from Texas, where the plaintiff challenged that the way that Texas did the redistricting violated the Equal Protection Clause and the one person, one vote, because they were basing it on total population instead of the individuals who could vote within the district. The court ruled unanimously and upheld the use of total population, but there was a concurring opinion by Justice Thomas and Alito, which expressed that total population is not the only permissible way. The court may also allow other ways if they are presented with different methods by which a state decides to use what population the state decides to use for redistricting purposes. Redistricting and the Voting Rights Act. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I do want to get to the New York portion, but really what we look at when we challenge redistricting is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits the use of any voting qualification or practice, and that includes the drawing of redistricting plans that result in the denial or abridgment of the right to vote based on race, color, or membership in a language minority. A violation of Section 2 is established if, under the totality of the circumstances, it is shown that the political processes lead to nomination or election in the state or political subdivision are not equally open to participation and that its members have less opportunity than other members of the electorate to participate in the political processes and to elect representatives of their choice. The jingles factors, these are the factors that a plaintiff must prove under a voter dilution claim under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. We can spend probably a whole day speaking about this and how this applies and the factors that the court would consider, but I'm highlighting them and I'm happy to chat offline about them. And I do also want to mention the creation of majority minority districts, which can result from challenges to voter dilution claims in which the racial or language minority group comprises a voting majority. So I want to speak about gerrymandering, which I actually learned a couple weeks ago. Some people, it's actually known as gerrymandering, but most people use the term gerrymandering, and that's the drawing of districts that dilute minority voting strength and prevent communities of interest from electing candidates of their choice. So to give an example, you heard the term cracking and packing of districts here. And not to be political, I'll just call them red and blue. As you see on the left, cracking occurs, which is a method implemented by during redistricting where the voting power of a certain party or community is kind of cracked. You'll see in the district that there's 12 blue, 18 red, so a population total of 30. And the way that the 6 districts were drawn is drawn in a way that no matter that, even though there could be a majority blue district, they're split up in a way that they do not hold any power within any of the 6 districts. So it's done by splitting its population and spreading its members along several districts where they become an irrelevant minority. So no matter how they decide to vote collectively, they would not be able to be successful. The packing of a district occurs where one party or community in packing a group of one party or community in as few districts as possible to reduce their influence in the remaining districts. So even here, there are 6 districts. We see 1 blue district, but overall, as let's say in New York State, if this was done, that blue district would not have enough power to be able to elect an official of their choosing. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which Lucia mentioned briefly, this was a great protection for many communities of color in terms of redistricting. This was based, so under Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, jurisdictions which had previously shown as history of discrimination were required to pre-clear, so they had to get approval for any redistricting map by the Department of Justice or by the District Court of the District of Columbia before they were allowed to be implemented. In New York, this meant that Bronx, Kings, and New York County had to submit their plans of redistricting before they were approved. The Shelby v. Holder case held that the coverage formula that was used under Section 4 to determine which states would have to comply with Section 5 was unconstitutional, and therefore Section 5 was unenforceable. Really what this means for redistricting, and this will be the first redistricting cycle that we have without the protection of Section 5, is that we will likely see maps that are implemented that somehow dilute the voting power of minority, racial, or language minority groups. This is unfortunate because Section 5 allowed for these plans to be reviewed before they were implemented, and now we will have to wait for them to be implemented before we can raise any challenges. So knowing that litigation is costly, knowing that it takes months, if not years, we will definitely see the harm already at play before any changes can be made. So the New York redistricting process, as it stood prior to the 2014 amendments, the redistricting was conducted by the state legislature through the Legislative Task Force on Demographic Research and Reapportionment, which you will hear known as LATFR. They, as noted in my slide, they were composed of a 6-member committee, of which 2 were not members of the legislature. So they would draw their maps, they would submit it to the legislature for approval, and each house would pass legislation approving the maps or amending the maps, and then it was subject to majority vote and a potential governor veto. While the legislature was not bound by LATFOR's recommendations, the heavy political influence of the task force meant that the final maps often mirrored the recommendations presented by LATFOR. The way this process actually played out was that the Senate Republicans drew maps that helped them maintain their control in the chamber. in exchange for allowing Democrats to hold maps cementing their hold on the assembly. There was no real public input about this. Each house drew maps in a way that ensured that they would hold their incumbency. The constitutional requirements as it stood prior to the 2014 amendment, there have been additional changes added. State legislative maps were required to be contiguous, in that it was possible to travel from any point in the district to any other point without crossing district boundaries, meaning that if I crossed the street and I visited my neighbor, I was not stepping in and out of different districts. They were meant to be compact, which there's no clear definition of what that means, but usually it's refers to a geometric shape where constituents generally live near each other is considered to be compact. And state legislative maps were required to respect county and municipal boundaries as well. Redistricting issues following the 2010 census. There was, prior to the 2010, or in 2010 actually, Republicans gained control of the Senate, and based on the census number push for a creation of an additional Senate seat, which became the 63rd Senate seat in New York. There was also litigation that followed, Favors v. Cuomo 1 and 2, both which, first one which was filed over the New York State Senate and Assembly's failure to draw congressional redistricting maps in time for the 2012 primaries. The second, which was equal protection challenges to New York Senate plan, which included the creation of the 63rd seat, and the way that districts were done in a way that districts in New York City were actually overpopulated, and districts in upstate were underpopulated, meaning that districts in upstate could have a or greater voting power than districts in New York City. There was also prison gerrymandering litigation that followed the census. Prison gerrymandering being the ability for districts to count individuals who are incarcerated as residing within their political or voting district instead of the district where the individual considers their home. This meant that many upstate counties suffered from, or not suffered, but they were able to use their large incarcerated population as a way to kind of boast their actual population in a way that would allow them to create voting districts that they ordinarily would not be able to draw because they would probably not be able to meet the population requirements. And then reform, I think this is, as Asher mentioned before, one of our other speakers would speak about what happened after 2014, but really what led to the reform or this idea of reform that individuals speak of now. In 2009, a group known as the New York Uprising led an initiative by then former Mayor Coach, calling for reform that would create a nonpartisan redistricting commission. At that point, there was a lot of support from Republicans on this initiative. However, when the Republicans took control of the Senate, they pushed not for reform, but for a constitutional amendment. They said that that was the only way that could be done. At that same time, then soon to be elected Governor Cuomo ran on a campaign where he was speaking on changing this process and really focusing on doing away with any sort of hyper-partisan maps. In fact, when he was elected, he threatened to veto any hyper-partisan map. We know that in 2012 that did not occur. There was no commission, there was no veto by the governor, and so the 2014 amendments were actually a result of a deal that was struck where then Governor Cuomo stated that they would keep the process the same for the 2012 redistricting cycle in exchange for a constitutional amendment that would create a quote unquote independent commission. I use the term in quotes, not because I think it's not independent, but because the actual ballot initiative did away with using the term independent because they did not want to confuse voters into thinking that the commission was independent from the legislature. That is all for my part.
Great, thank you, Fulvia. Thank you so much for covering the process, the legal and technical aspects of this super complicated and obscure process, which, as we know, you know, that in itself is an obstacle to really advocating for and winning fair districts. So a lot has changed since the last redistricting cycle in New York. And actually, we want to switch gears now to hearing briefly from a few different people about what's going on with redistricting advocacy, what sort of tools are at our disposal, excuse me, what changes that have occurred in the law recently, and what can we do about it? So how can we make a difference? And I would like to pass the microphone to Steve Romalewski. Steve is the director of the CUNY Mapping Service at the Center for Urban Research at the CUNY Grad Center. And we're really happy to have the Center for Urban Research as partners with us in this work. And Steve's going to give us an overview of advocacy going on and tech tools that have really changed what we can do with redistricting advocacy. So thank you, Steve.
Great, thanks so much, Asher. We're really honored to transition from our work helping organizations around the country, especially in New York, focus on the 2020 census and mapping historically undercounted communities, to work with organizations like NYIC and all of you on the call to help understand redistricting, what that means in terms of the maps and the data. And so I'm going to give, as Asher said, kind of an overview of what's available online, what's available otherwise, and how to start incorporating this information into your work. Our team at the Center for Urban Research just launched a new online map called Redistricting in You, which I'll talk about a little more in a moment. But just to highlight that we have a page at that map of a wealth of online resources that are available now for this redistricting cycle, many of which were not available before, that you can all use. This is just one place that kind of brings it all together in one page with all of these links that you see on the screen now. There's a number of others, but I just mentioned this one as an example. Because we're waiting, everyone is waiting for the 2020 census data that we'll all use to draw maps and see what the new patterns, population patterns look like. In some ways, yes, that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity to spend more time with efforts like what the Immigration Coalition is doing now, and think about the process, learn more about the process, and also learn and think about more about your communities. So here are just some examples. These are slides will be online, so you could access these sites that talk about the process specific to New York, what the prior speaker just talked about. And then in addition to these online resources about the process, you can think more about what your community is like, how it's changed since the districts were drawn in 2012, what the representation has been like so far in your community, who are your representatives in Congress and the state legislature, and to help with this, because the redistricting process is a combination of communities bringing their voices to the table about what their communities are like and how they should be represented, and combining that with the data, because you need to infuse the data with all of your concerns, but the maps will ultimately be drawn based on the population data at the local level, and that has to be legally sustainable. And so there are a number of sites where you can begin kind of combining those two things. This one, districtor.org, enables you to go onto a map and just sort of move your mouse over the map and paint what your community might look like or should look like, and how that compares with others nearby. ACLU has a site where you can see very easily how your congressional districts have changed over time. So you could access the slide and view that map. There are a number of projects that are available where you can go online to begin drawing districts. You can't yet now because we don't have the 2020 data, but you can begin testing these. One of them is districtbuilder.org, and there are a number of others. And then the map that we launched recently called Redistricting in You highlights what the existing districts look like and what their population characteristics are in terms of which ones will likely need to shrink because they have too many people compared to the statewide average, or expand geographically to bring in more people. And it uses the latest population estimates until we actually get the 2020 data. And we'll also be taking that one step further for New York in particular to enable you to very easily compare the current district lines with proposed district plans once the district plans start to be drawn based on the 2020 data, which will be available later in the fall. And we'll also have local tract level and perhaps block level and precinct level information, so you can get a sense of what the latest population patterns look like within those districts. And again, think more about what that means for you, your community's concerns, and how you can bring that to the table when the independent commission and the legislature gets involved in actually drawing the lines. And so just to go over a couple of examples of gerrymandering in New York to follow on the presentation before me, and to give some real world examples of what's going on in New York. There are a lot to choose from, so I won't go into all of them, but I'll just pick a couple and I'll go through these slides quick, just to highlight that, you know, the maps that I'll show you aren't necessarily bad. However, they definitely give examples visually of how the prior speaker said communities can be divided or combined or cracked or packed. And you can then think about what that means for you locally and how to express your concerns about that going forward as new lines are being proposed. So this example, and I'll just talk about the state Senate districts on Long Island compared with assembly districts on Long Island. And what this map shows, the black lines show the state Senate districts that were drawn in 2012, and the color shaded census blocks show the overall race and Hispanic origin concentrations throughout the Nassau and part of Suffolk County. And the population patterns are from 2010. And I did that because I used that particular characteristic or that data set because the lines were drawn using this 2010 data that represents these patterns. The patterns, I'm sure, have changed since then, but the lines were drawn based on the 2010 data. And you can see that in a number of places. So in Suffolk County, the map on the right, the part of the map on the right, the green area represents concentration of Hispanic or Latino population. And you can see that the two Senate districts split that population almost in half. And then moving over to the western part of Nassau County on the left of the map, the orange areas show where concentrations of Black population are predominantly located, again, based on 2010 data. And you can see that several Senate districts, again, just cut right through those communities. In contrast, the assembly districts that you can see on the map now show where the assembly districts include all of those communities, and they don't cut them or split them or crack them. Now, you know, these may be examples of packing the district, and it's something that you need to weigh and think about, but you could just see the difference anyway between the Senate lines and the assembly lines and how those boundaries treat the local communities of interest and the local population patterns. Again, focused on race and Hispanic origin, that's not the only way to look at communities of interest and how your community or neighborhood should be represented, although it's probably the most high priority one in terms of how the courts will look at the lines and how the legislators and the redistricting commission will look at the lines. It is just one lens of several, and so there's a lot of information out there. We look forward to working with the Immigration Coalition to help you make sense of this data and all of the other organizations involved and how to incorporate this into your work. So I'll stop now. Again, there's a lot of other information there that we've mapped and we'll continue to map with the coalition, but I'll pass it on to Asher for the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. It's really great to see and learn more about the tools that are out there and ways that we can use the data. A lot has changed since the last cycle, and we're going to talk in a moment about how at New York Immigration Coalition in our work, we're in partnership with CUNY. We're going to be using a lot of these maps and data to help visualize what the impacts are and how these districts, may or may not lead to good representation for our communities. And we will circle back to that, but it's now I would like to actually move to Melody Lopez, who is Executive Director of New York Civic Engagement Table. And Melody is going to speak about the efforts to reform the redistricting process in New York recently. You know, what's been going on in recent times and how that could impact us in this cycle. So thank you so much, Melody, for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here and share just a little bit about some background on what's changed since the last redistricting cycle, and some potential for additional advocacy to further improve the process. So I'll keep my remarks brief because I know you all have a lot of work ahead in synthesizing all of this and thinking through your own plans. But it was mentioned earlier that there was some organizing that happened after the 2010 redistricting process with the goal of trying to reform it and divest it a bit more from the state legislature. And the end result of that process was a amendment that appeared before the voters in 2014 that was and it passed. So now as a result, we have a redistricting commission, which does function somewhat separately. I would say somewhat because I'll explain why it's somewhat distinctly from the legislature. But the thing that's really important to point out about the function of this commission is that it is not fully independent of the legislature in the way that some other states have independent redistricting commissions, because the legislature has final say over the maps. And I won't get into like the full complexity of the voting mechanics because we don't have that much time today. But the main takeaway is that the legislature has final consent and approval over any maps created by the commission. And they also appoint the majority of the commissioners. So there's 10 members and 8 of them are appointed by legislative leaders, 4 on the Republican side, 4 on the Democratic side. And then the final 2 are appointed by the selected 8 commissioners, and they one of the requirements is that they not be affiliated with any party. One of the things that's not a best practice is that it's an even number of commissioners, so that makes it challenging to have agreement. And I think one of the things I wanted to point out that's a real opportunity for everyone here today, and the groups that we work with at the New York Civic Engagement Table, is the public hearing process, which will be taking place approximately in September. I say approximately because it may be impacted by the census data as it comes out. And it will be held in the cities of Albany, Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, White Plains, and the counties of Bronx, Kings, New York, Queens, Richmond, Nassau, and Suffolk. So all over the state, and this is a very new opportunity where there wasn't any public hearing process ever before. And it's something I think as we're all developing our plans to advocate for equitable maps and make our proposals for what we see as true representation, this is an opportunity to go on the record, place some pressure on decision makers to draw maps that are more representative of our communities. And that's something that I think a lot of folks are working towards, and having these discussions with stakeholders to think through what our proposals can be. So I just really wanted to, in my time with you all, really emphasize that opportunity. And in addition, I would also say that there is a pending additional new amendment, even though we haven't even fully had one process with this current process that came out of this last amendment, that would make changes to the timeline, that because of one of the major needs is there was a reform in 2019 that consolidated our primaries. And so now our primaries are much earlier in June for the state legislative and gubernatorial year next year. And so they needed to respond to that and have the maps be done sooner, which means that the current deadline is moving up, and the maps would need to be when they're under the, sorry, I don't want to get too complicated here, but it's like one just a thing that's good to remember is that in January of next year, the current deadline is that the commission would send the maps between January 1st and 15th to the legislature for their review. And the new deadline would be that they would send them this year in the fall, which will be challenging given the census data, but the public hearing process remains unchanged. And I really wanted to emphasize that that's a huge opportunity, since this is once in a decade opportunity here. And in our communities, or have an opportunity to be on the record around what maps we would like to see for our folks. I would also just mention in the proposed amendment coming up this fall is the fixing the number of state Senate seats. It was mentioned by the speaker from Latino Justice that was an attempt to sort of, it leads to partisan gerrymandering, and it was an attempt for the Republicans to maintain their control. So it freezes the number of state Senate seats to mitigate or to take away that potential lever of partisan gerrymandering. And then also affirms total population as the basis for redistricting, which is already in practice, but it makes it part of the Constitution and does away with archaic language that was exclusive of non-citizens and Native Americans. And it also constitutionalizes the end of prison gerrymandering, which is, as was mentioned earlier, is already in our statutes, but it's not in our state constitution. So there are some really affirmative, good changes in there. And we're at the New York Civic Engagement table. We are moving forward with a voter education campaign later this year, because I'm sure, lots of voters, we don't typically have constitutional amendments on the ballot. So we want to make sure that voters are aware of this and understand what the implications are when they go to vote in the fall. That this is something that they have an opportunity to have a say in. And many of the New York Civic Engagement table and many of our partners, not all of them, but many of them are supportive of these changes because it moves in the right direction. It's not everything we'd want to see in terms of improvements. I think the ultimate goal is to have a fully independent, citizen-led redistricting commission that has full power over the map-making process that is truly independent of the legislature. So that is truly nonpartisan and divested from the interests of current elected officials, I think is our ultimate goal. And so I know I'm probably at time, so I'm going to just close by saying that, I definitely think as you all are moving forward and thinking about your plans, would definitely consider, opportunities to educate the public on the amendment coming up this fall, and opportunities to get on the record around what maps you are pushing for this fall and September.
Melody, could you answer one question, please?
Sure.
Thanks. How could it not interfere by moving the deadline up if we're supposed to, the community, have an opportunity to respond to IRC's proposed maps that they draw after the census data becomes available on September 30th? How can, it's like a fait accompli if they have to submit it to the legislature in the fall when we, the community, have not yet had an opportunity to respond to IRC's draft plans following the release of the census data in September?
So just one clarification, this first cycle, it's a little bit different. And that going forward after this cycle, according to this amendment, it would be that fall deadline. But for this one, just only for 2022, I'm glad you asked that because that's an important clarification. Only for 2022, the requirement is no later than January 1st. So it just moves it up by 2 weeks. And it's in recognition of that reality that they wouldn't be able to completely shift it up all the way to having the process to go before the legislature this year. So it is recognizing that. It's still a very, very tight timeline, but theoretically there is some time for a public process, and that has been untouched by the constitutional amendment. And in terms of the locations and the timing of the public process, even though there's some ambiguity around what the impact of the census data arrival is. So yes, I'm glad you asked that question because it's an important clarification that this cycle, but only for 2022, the deadline is actually January 1st. I hope that addresses your question.
Yes, thank you very much, Melody. Very clear. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, Thank you so much, Melody, and thank you for the question, Liz. And so, yes, Melody spoke, about how there's been some really important changes to the redistricting process. We have seen that we are going to have issues with the data being delayed till the end of September, a very tight timeline for an independent commission to make maps. The commission itself is somewhat problematic in the way that it's composed. But at the same time, we believe in at the New York Immigration Coalition, we really believe that we have some new opportunities, with 12 hearings across the state that are mandated in the fall, to really make a difference and to do what we do well, which is, bring people out and mobilize and educate and mobilize community to really get their voices heard. So I actually would like to, we're moving towards the end of the agenda, and at this stage, before we get there, I would actually like to move into talking about the work that NYIC is going to undertake from now through the next year, the year from now. And so, following up on what Melody said, we feel like there is new opportunities for really important grassroots advocacy work, and on what Steve said, there are many additional tools and ways that we can use the data and bring them to our communities to educate and mobilize them. So with that, I wanted to just give an overview of the work that we're undertaking and that we hope to partner with all of you on. And so I just wanted to note that, people mentioned this and that group and government body and various organizations out there doing different kinds of work. Right now, you're looking at lists of some of the relevant players. This is by no means comprehensive, but we've talked about LAT4, we've talked about the Independent Commission, the state legislature, which passes the maps as law, and the governor who signs them. And so on the government side, we have those important groups. And then in the advocacy world, in that space, we have a number of different groups. And like I said, this is by no means comprehensive, but I just wanted to give a sampling of some of the important groups that are working on this locally, as well as nationally. You can see at the bottom, Mexican American Legal Defense and Asian American Justice Center are two of the very important national groups. So the reason I show you this is because you'll see a lot of groups that have particular perspective and area that they are fighting for fair districts in. For instance, there are a lot of legal advocacy organizations that are doing very important, litigation and legal advocacy in this space. We also have a lot of good government groups that are really trying to hold our government accountable to have a fair process and educate people about this constitutional amendment that will be on the ballot, for instance. And I also want to mention that, at the NYIC, we really, as a coalition of local grassroots organizations, we believe that we can really do more to do community education and mobilization. And so in other words, our campaign is really focused on really talking about the impacts and what's relevant to people in their daily lives, and really trying to demystify and help people understand this process and how important it is, and then elevate their voice, educate and mobilize. So I just wanted to note that we feel that, at NYIC, our campaign is going to be focused on that community education and mobilization work, as well as, elected official engagement, and as well as legal advocacy. But with that said, our campaign, Mapping Our Future, is what we have called our campaign. And our goals are very simple and straightforward: to prevent partisan gerrymandering in this redistricting cycle, and to protect and strengthen political representation and power for immigrant communities and communities of color. And to do this, we have several tactics. I won't go into detail on it, but as part of the New York Counts Coalition and the New York Counts work to get a complete census count, NYIC and many groups really developed some really effective tactics, and we are going to bring a lot of that coalition and a lot of those tactics into this work, because we feel that, as Murad mentioned at the top, that redistricting is census 2.0. You know, this is why we fought hard to get a full count. And now we need to make sure that translates into political representation and power for our communities. So we're going to be, in the first phase of our campaign, doing many community educational events in partnership with our NYIC partner organizations. We're going to use a lot of the maps and educational materials that Steve mentioned. We're going to be developing regional educational toolkits and also talking to community local partners about what those toolkits should look like, what the messaging should be, and how to make this really effective. We're going to also be mobilizing people to turn out to these hearings of the commission of LAT4. And this is really critical. You know, we educate with our community and then we mobilize them to really turn out and testify and show up at, you know, at public hearings, as well as do days of action, you know, where we actually turn out in Albany and locally to really amplify this issue. We're going to be doing a whole lot of media work. Like I said, we're going to be engaging elected officials to really do the right thing. And we're going to do legal advocacy and litigation. And so I just wanted to lay out what these tactics are, but purpose of this convening, like I say, is to hear from our partners and to really shape this with everyone. So we're going to do small group conversations for 20 minutes in just a few minutes from now. And this is really an opportunity for us to hear from all of you and really then move on to developing what some of the content is going to be in some of this work and for people to take on whatever it is they are able to take on. So the last thing I'll show you is a timeline. How is our campaign overlay on the actual legal timeline for redistricting? At the top of this screen, you'll see this is the original timeline before the data was delayed, that the census data would come out in June. Then we would see an independent commission plan. We would have hearings in the fall. We would see the state legislature then make a plan in the spring, and we would be doing, you know, all of this work throughout this period, and then the districts get used in June. I'm not going to focus and get too technical on what the changes are today. We can certainly delve into this more at later events, but you know, all the state timeline got moved back in a way that's very problematic. But where are we right now? NYIC has done a ton of research and policy work leading up to today to start developing these educational toolkits, you know, and start developing the media and all of that work that we're going to need to deploy. So right now, March 29th is our convening. And after today and after this kickoff event, we're going to be rolling out in the month of April community education events from April throughout the summer and fall. And this is where we hope to partner with many of you on this really critical work. And then in the fall, we're going to be doing mobilizations at public hearings, and we're going to be, you know, preparing people to testify and to turn out for these hearings. Then finally, in the spring, we are going to do additional mobilizations to Albany and locally, you know, to really fight for a fair plan for our communities, and again, amplify the voices of our partners. And so that is the basic timeline for the state redistricting process, as well as for our campaign. And we're really going to continue to ramp up between April and next spring. And so I am actually going to stop there. And like I mentioned, now is when we would like to have a brief but really critical small group discussion with all of you. And we are going to be breaking up into breakout rooms, and we have a staff member in each breakout room who is going to have some discussion questions or just will listen and take notes on and get everyone's input. And we will be, you know, using all that information to shape our campaign. So with that, I would like it for Noah to help us with putting people into our breakout rooms, where and if you will bear with us for a minute or two, we will get everyone into a small group, and then we can have a discussion, we can bring it back, and we can then close and just recap what our next steps are. So we'll take just a moment to move into small rooms for breakout. While we are doing that, oh, here we go. Hello, how are you? Thank you so much for speaking earlier.
Hey, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Thank you to our speakers who are represented here in this room, and others. So we're just gonna take about 15 minutes to discuss. Actually, there's 19 minutes on the clock. And I'm gonna share some discussion questions right now. But please don't be limited to this. Really, the purpose is to hear from whatever people have on their minds about the process. Are y'all able to see my questions?
Yeah, I can see the questions.
We can see it.
Okay, beautiful. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to take up space here, but I would love to hear from people about, and particularly people in the local, partner organizations. Although we were lucky to hear Talib and Ramdat already speak a little bit about this. But I would love to hear, what do you think will make this type of advocacy work successful? What do local groups need to do this work? And what messaging will be effective? These are some questions that we're not limited to them, but I'm happy to cede the floor.
Do I have the floor, or someone else talking?
Yeah. I'll facilitate. Yes, Talib,
Okay.
please. Thank you.
So I think really what is key is helping people to understand exactly what they can do to assist. I mean, clearly we understand you're putting pressure on our representatives, but but one thing I myself even wonder, at what point will the community be involved in the process? If I'm living in Lackawanna and our office is in Lackawanna, and if there is a discussion about removing Lackawanna and putting it in, included in neighborhoods that don't reflect the constituents of Lackawanna, with making us the minority, at what point do we hear that? And at what point are we able to say, hey, what are we able to do about that situation? So that type of thing, I think, would be extremely helpful and clear as far as knowing that, and who's the actual individuals that are looking at dividing or creating these lines, so that we can have some type of regular communication, if you will, with potential allies that are at the table.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that.
Yeah, one thing that needs to be emphasized is to get people to understand what redistricting is. And I usually suggest to somebody that they look outside their window. Do the schools need more teachers? Do the hospitals need more beds? Do the roads need more paving? What do you need fixed outside where you are right now? And that relates to who represents you in Washington, Albany, and City Hall. And that's redistricting, how the districts are drawn, how you're being served by the people that you elect. That's a very root issue that people have to understand. And this is now my fifth round on redistricting, and often people have no idea what this is about. You've got to localize it and personalize it.
Thank you for that, Jeff. And we're really lucky to have you and your expertise here at the table too. And I think, we did hear, what was really great was that we really did hear about some of these impacts and how it translates into people's everyday lives locally, and the example of in Queens and even the visual of like being like, look, it's their problem, like with our elected officials in some of these cracked, communities. That is very powerful to hear about this.
One thing that, I would recommend is, I guess, creating like a survey to be able for people to hear these stories, or like for them to tell you these stories. Because the only reason I don't live in Queens, I live in the Bronx. And the only reason I've heard about these issues because of our organization, because we do work around the city. And, I think when we're looking at redistricting, we need to think about, which communities have been the most disenfranchised in the last 10 years, in terms of not just voting power, but also economically, social impact, and taking that into account as well. And that's why I am here to constantly advocate for South Queens, which has been the most disenfranchised community in terms of how fractured on the state level and also on the local level, how it's been sliced and diced into different elected officials.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, I actually was working on redistricting in the last cycle as well. And one of the things that at the Latino Justice, in fact, one of the things that really caught my attention was the Taking Our Seat group, which I believe arose at that time. And that to me, it felt like, first of all, they have a great name that I'm, jealous that they got that really awesome name. But also, it just seemed like it showed the social impact. It was really speaking to local impact in a really powerful way. And that's what we want to really grow, even more in coalition with groups like that. Yeah, John.
So Jeff and I are here not as representatives of our neighborhood, but the group of people who are kind of experts who've been involved in redistricting for many decades and seen, the nitty-gritty of the process several times, as well as understand some of the larger issues. And it seems to me that, the technical side of the process has a fairly steep learning curve to learn about all the rules and the data sources and the crafty ways redistricting has done things with them, and ending up with some sort of agenda of where are the worst problems or who's gotten screwed the most. I mean, you mentioned taking our seats in the South Asian community of Queens. That's been divided for a long time. It's gotten a little bit less divided, and that is considered to be a gain, but it's still not anywhere near, where it would be if South Asians were kind of at the front of the list of priorities in drawing districts in Queens. So it seems to me that somehow it would be useful to have an overview of, where the problems are and what the problems are. And I know you and we and others have talked about coming up with that. I mean, different communities have somewhat different ideas about what the problems are and what the priorities are. But I think that objectively speaking, you can certainly identify where the cracked, communities are and stuff like that. And I know that you've been wanting to do that. But I'm just curious as to everyone who's participating in the breakout room, what are your thoughts about what's the best way, to get that to happen?
Oh, let me also add to that, John, being the other non-specific community, been around the block a few times expert. When we really get down to nitty gritty on this, we have an entirely new process. We have a commission of 10 members who are likely to deadlock because the one party has the cards to object to a plan because they can veto or object to the commission getting anywhere. And we have a Democratic Assembly and Senate. And the real question is going to get down to dealing with the leaderships in both chambers, in that the Senate Democrats are going to need to protect their majority. I litigated 2 decades straight against the Senate lines. Democrats now hold the districts in many cases where the Democrats challenged and litigated against the last 20 years. Another issue is in terms of the Assembly, as the commission might try to bring down the population deviations, or the legislature itself, that's going to threaten the Assembly majority because most of the Democratic districts downstate are underpopulated. So all these efforts are good. We need to show how communities should be made whole. Every time you make a district whole, use the example of the Asian American Legal Defense Fund has a wonderful PowerPoint that shows how the Asian American community in Queens and other parts of New York City has been divided into 4, 5, 6, even 8 separate assembly districts. But when you get down to it, if you put those communities whole, you might knock out 3 or 4 members of the assembly. So the bigger question here really is how to deal with getting something enacted that is both realistic, sellable to the leadership, and acceptable and meaningful to this coalition. I might be jumping ahead a lot, but that's really where this whole thing might be taking us by December of this year, as the legislature approaches January and its own deadline to get a plan enacted by the end of January so that they can proceed with the June primary.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a lot of challenges here for sure. And I mean, I think that's one of the strengths of a coalition organization, to John's point, is that we can see where the problems are from a higher view, and we can take into account all of the local organizations and their specific concerns while trying to mesh it and put it into a big coalition campaign. And I think that could be very powerful.
Yeah, I'm just suggesting that expectations be geared, towards the big prize at the end is getting this done in a meaningful way. Yes, you've got to go through all the organizing, the educating, the testifying. I've been at every LAT4 hearing since the task force was first created. I've seen all this. I've helped organize these hearings. I've worked in the Assembly for the Assembly plan and in the Senate against the Senate plan. So I've seen the whole, yin and yang of this, how it works. And I've seen at the end how the leaderships will do what they want to do. And that could be what happens again this time, but the leaderships are all new.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, I wanted to go ahead, John.
I'm sorry to disrupt the flow, but I mean, Jeff's point is fundamental, that the Independent Redistricting Commission is sort of designed to fail in this instance, and the whole process is going to be telescoped. And so the key question is, how do we build some sort of bridge between what the real core issues of the NYIC member groups are in their neighborhoods and the deal that is going to be cut by the leadership of the 2 chambers. So I'd like to ask both Jeff and Asher and everyone else, so what's your advice about how to have some leverage in that crunch that's going to be coming?
Well, there are different factors that need to be looked at in terms of who the current members are, what their districts look like, and what the hotspot districts might be, especially in the Senate, because they were drawn to increase a Democratic majority throughout. You've got incumbents, many new incumbents, especially then in the Senate, who never would have dreamed to have, of winning 2, 4, 6 years ago. Just to be very specific, the Biaggi district in the Bronx, we've been challenging that as a racially gerrymandered district for 20 years. Now a Democrat holds it. We've been challenging Brooklyn districts just the same. Grenada's Democrat has it now. So we really need to look at the incumbents. What do the leaders need from their members? And a lot of that might mean, for the first time, is actually educating the state legislators about the concerns about community, because the new trend across the country, is to create districts based on communities of interest. And that's how districts should have been created 200 years ago, but haven't been. So as you look at communities being made whole, you look at incumbents being left out. And that's the challenge. I don't have the answer yet. No one does, but that's what we have to keep in mind as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jeff. And I'm curious if anyone else, and anyone who hasn't spoken, Katie, Lillian, Ree, Yvonne, if you wanted to add anything about any of these topics, or about, what do you think, what sort of message could be effective? What sort of organizing methods could be effective as we go to that stage of educational work?
Well, I'm kind of new to this whole process, and I've heard a lot. And there are people in this particular room that have an awful lot of experience. And I think it would be important to somehow to condense that experience into simpler terms for people like me to understand why this is so important. I understand about, the census and redistricting, and, we can get more schools and we can get more hospital beds and stuff like that. But the political aspect, I don't think is as well known to a, layman like me. I'm the person outside of the grocery store that signs the petition. That's about it. Okay, so if you could somehow condense it and tell us how important this is to us, maybe that would help.
It's the future empowerment of your community.
Mm-hmm.
Does your community want to have a voice? Do you want to see change and get things done? Do you want to see people that reflect your interest represent you? Or do you want to be part, I'll be hypothetical here, of a sliver of a district that has an incumbent with 10 communities, all of which she or he really can't cover all the time? Or do you want to have a unified representation in Washington or Albany or City Hall, where the representative that you elect understands you, knows you, and visualizes and feels the need for what needs to be changed and made better in your community?
Thank you for that. Yeah, but as a canvasser, it's got to be short. It's all about the wrap and making it impactful. Short.
Yes, and I think that for Asians, there might be a language difficulty, so anything that John and Jeff could condense needs to be translated. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think we have a lot of capacity at NYIC to make sure that happens, as well, and that we could support our partners with all the materials translated, with presenters speaking in all various languages. That is one thing that we want to definitely take advantage of.
Right, and then I think it should be more basic rather than, do you have someone who represents you that believes in your values? It should be something about shelter and food.
Yeah, totally. And we have
very,
heard that
very
from a lot of partners. Yeah, we've definitely heard that piece of input, and I'm writing it in my notes as well. And
that's a very interesting and well taken point. I appreciate that.
Definitely. Really appreciate that.
And
would anyone else like to speak to those points? Yeah, please.
I just want to point out that Lillian brought up a really good point, and we have to educate all of the immigrant communities and make sure that this information is translated in Asian languages, but also all languages, as many as possible, because it's very critical. I'm co-leading the language access campaign, and it is very critical to inform our community, maybe through the parents, through the children.
That's a great point as well, actually. Yes, I mean, we need to do social media promotion, and we need to be thinking about what is going to reach younger people as well. I think, to your point, that's a great one. Thank you for that. And yeah, in our final minute, does anyone have any more thoughts? I think this is really important to listen and to hear these ideas. And going forward, we're going to have smaller, like regional meetings, essentially, to really plan this out and hear about what are the impacts locally, and what are the groups think is going to really be relevant to their clients and constituents as well. And I think getting local with this is really important as well. Yeah, thank you. This is really helpful. And yeah, I guess to some of John and Jeff's points, like coalition has the power of being able to elevate numerous voices, and we want to then see as the things move forward how we can All right, thank you everyone for participating in small group discussions. We took really extensive notes. I know in my group, I heard a lot of really great ideas and really important perspective that we want to use as we plan and execute this campaign. Noah, is the rooms are all back, right? Is that right?
Yeah, but Asher, before you go on, could
Yes.
no, I forget her, I got her, could Joan finish her thing? She was talking about how, the IRC is not funded yet. We are clicking the days down before we know what's in the budget. And LAT4 is funded. So I just want to know why our strategy is not, as Fod mentioned once to me from Drum, why our strategy is not to ask that they defund LAT4 and fund IRC instead. So Joan, could you mind finishing your thoughts so everybody knows what's going on? Okay.
Yeah, happy to hear more about that. We're also going to be having a follow-up meeting where we can definitely get into that topic and really collaboratively make a strategy around this. I mean, to my mind, we want to do both. We want to have a strategy for LAT4 and for the IRC, right? And
okay, we don't have much time left. It's April 1st is like around the corner. So, could we just address that real quickly? Do you mind if Joan finishes her thought?
No, yeah, she can.
Okay, Joan, Joan, do you want to unmute? Oh, she can't unmute, Asher.
Oh, okay. Perhaps one of us can do that. Sure, I'd love to hear.
I was just saying, LAT4 does have its place, and it shouldn't be defunded, but the commission does need funding. And there are 3 people in the room right now looking at that. The governor did not have it in his budget. I was just saying to people, if you have a relationship with your assembly person or your Senate person, contact them about getting funding, because the commission is not able to function without money.
Absolutely, and that's one of the major burning questions right now, is how are we going to even fund this commission, right, to do this important work. So thank you for that, Joan, and to Liz's point, it's getting late in that timeline to do that, so we absolutely want to make that a big priority. We are almost at the end of our time today, and I want to thank everyone, and I want to just mention what some of our next steps are going to be. First and foremost is that we're going to be reaching out to all of you with a follow-up survey that's asking which types of activities do you feel that you have an interest and a capacity to be a part of, whether it's community education and mobilization, whether it could be research, it could be lobbying, and we will lay all of that out in a survey. And one of the important next steps is that people step up across the different regions, right, to be partners and that we have a geographic balance across the state. I think that's an important part of any strategy in tackling this issue. And so the next steps are going to be, please fill out a survey to tell us how you want to get involved, and we'll identify clearly some very specific ways that you can get involved. We're also going to distribute the recording and the notes from this meeting so that you could share more widely with your groups. And you can also email me, aross@nyicaction.org, if you have a more of a long form or free form question or anything at all that you know, an idea, strategy, anything, feedback. I'd love to get your feedback at aross@NYIC And yeah, the last thing is we're going to have a monthly meeting. Sorry, just last thing is that we will be reaching out and seeing who wants to come to monthly meetings that are more localized, you know, and more regional, and then plan what's going to be effective by region as a part of our strategy. Talib, did you have a question?
Yeah, Jeff had a quick response. Can you let Jeff respond to that one thing, please?
Yeah, if it's really quick, Jeff, please go ahead. If not, you know, we are going to set up a means of sharing information and ideas, and it could start, you know, we're going to have a monthly meeting. We're going to share out what we work out in those meetings. We're going to share opportunities for you to partner with us on community education and mobilization, and really shape it, you know, and really be collaborating on this whole project. We have a website now on our NYIC website. You can go in there to our work under campaigns. There is a page for redistricting, and that's another place where we'll be sharing updates as things progress. And I just want to thank everyone so much for taking nearly 2 hours of your time, and for these great breakout groups. Really appreciated all of your input.
I'm sorry.
And thank you all for being here. This is critical work, and we are going to occupy a really, really critical space to really make a difference in all of this work. And with that, I just want to wish you all a really great afternoon and week, and we will follow up with you shortly, and with slides, with video, and with notes. Thank you.